Alice never thought her first kiss would come while she was tied up, trembling, facing death, and that the man to give it would be a billionaire she had only just met. The night began like any other shift for Alice. She was 21 years old, a shy hotel waitress working her first big event at the luxurious Monarch Hotel. Her hands shook slightly as she balanced silver trays filled with sparkling champagne flutes, weaving carefully between glittering guests dressed in designer gowns and sharp suits. Her uniform felt tight and unfamiliar, a black dress with a high slit that clung to her small frame. She tugged at the hem nervously every few minutes, trying to pull it down further. Her heart pounded in her chest as she navigated the glamorous crowd. She was just a girl from a tiny apartment, trying to make enough money to pay her mother's hospital bills. She had never been part of this world, and she certainly never expected her life to collide with Nathan Blackwood, the billionaire CEO who stood at the center of attention in the room. Nathan Blackwood was everything Alice was not. 32 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair swept back perfectly, his tailored suit fitting like a second skin, he moved through the crowd with an effortless grace. Everyone seemed to look his way when he spoke, drawn to the quiet authority in his voice. Alice had only seen him in photos before, on magazine covers and in news clips, the mysterious tech genius who had built a billion-dollar empire almost overnight. Up close, he was even more intimidating, his gray eyes sharp, his jaw tense, like a man who carried the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. Alice tried to stay invisible, focusing on her work, but as she approached his table, her hands trembling, she accidentally knocked over a glass. The champagne spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, and before she could apologize, before anyone could react, everything changed. A sudden crash, shouts, the sound of masked men bursting through the doors, guns raised, screams rippled through the ballroom as the glamorous guests dove for cover. Alice froze, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear. One of the masked men grabbed her by the arm, yanking her upright. She barely had time to register the cold press of a gun barrel against her back before she was dragged to the center of the room. She heard someone shout, "Get the billionaire!" and realized they were after Nathan, but instead they shoved her forward, snarling that she must be wired, that the nervous little waitress must be an undercover cop or spy. Alice shook her head wildly, trying to explain, but they did not listen. She felt their hands on her, rough and angry, tearing at her uniform, shouting at her to strip, to prove she was not hiding a wire. Her eyes filled with tears, her face burning with shame. She could hear the panicked whispers of the crowd, could feel their eyes on her, watching this nightmare unfold. And then she saw him. Nathan had not cowered or ducked for cover like the others. He stood a few feet away, his eyes locked on hers, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. Without a word, he stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "Stop," he said, making even the armed men pause. "Touch her again, and you lose every dollar you hope to steal tonight." Alice's breath hitched as the room fell into a tense silence. The masked leader sneered, raising his gun toward Nathan, but the billionaire's gaze did not waver. He stepped closer, putting himself between Alice and the barrel, his broad shoulders shielding her trembling form. In that split second, Alice felt something shift inside her. Here was a man who had everything: wealth, power, control, and yet he had chosen to stand for her, a nobody, a scared girl whose world had been nothing but struggle and survival. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to thank him, but her limbs refused to move. Nathan turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Alice had never been kissed, never been held, never been protected by anyone. And yet here he was, offering her that without a word. The chaos swirled around them, but Alice clung to that one steady anchor, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a wild, unfamiliar hope. Alice's mind raced as she tried to steady her breathing. She could still feel the rough grip of the masked man's hands on her arms. the humiliation of being forced into the center of attention in the most terrifying way possible. But even more overwhelming was the presence of Nathan Blackwood standing protectively before her. She barely knew anything about him beyond what the tabloids printed, stories about his business takeovers, his icy demeanor, his relentless ambition. But none of those stories had prepared her for the real man, the one who had just risked his life to defend a girl he did not even know. Nathan's voice was firm, cutting through the tension in the room as he negotiated with the attackers. "You do not want to do this," he warned, his tone cool and lethal. "There are cameras everywhere. The police are on their way. Walk out now and you still have a chance." The masked leader snarled in response, pressing the gun closer to Nathan's chest. Alice gasped softly, her body trembling, but Nathan did not flinch. She had grown up knowing fear. Her father had left when she was just a baby, and her mother had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat until illness struck and took away even that fragile security. Alice had learned to survive by blending into the background, keeping her head down, never causing waves. She had never imagined herself standing in the middle of a hostage situation, facing down death with a billionaire shielding her. Nathan, on the other hand, had spent his life surrounded by power and danger. Orphaned at 12 after a car bombing killed his parents, he had been raised by ruthless business mentors, trained to trust no one, to outthink and outmaneuver every threat. He had clawed his way to the top of the corporate world with a reputation for brilliance and cold efficiency. But beneath the polished surface was a man who had never truly let anyone close until now. As the minutes ticked by, Nathan kept glancing at Alice, as if silently checking she was still holding on. She met his eyes and felt a strange surge of strength, as if his steadiness was flowing into her. Even tied up and terrified, she realized she was drawing courage from the sheer force of his presence. When the masked men finally bound them together, pushing them into a corner as they regrouped, Alice felt Nathan's shoulder brush hers. "Stay calm," he murmured, his voice low so only she could hear. "Help is coming." She wanted to believe him, but her heart hammered painfully in her chest. She had never been anyone's priority, never the person worth rescuing, and yet here was this man who could have saved himself, choosing to stay beside her. As the room settled into a tense hush, Alice took shaky breaths, forcing herself to think past the fear. She could hear the muffled voices of the attackers arguing among themselves, the clink of weapons being checked, the buzz of radios. She focused on the small details, the rhythm of Nathan's breathing beside her, the faint scrape of his watch band as he subtly tested the ropes around his wrists. She found herself watching him closely, marveling at his composure. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered when she thought no one would hear. Nathan's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "Because you matter," he said softly, eyes fixed ahead. "And because I refuse to let them win." For a girl who had spent her life feeling invisible, those words hit her like a thunderclap. Alice felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear, but from the fierce, unexpected realization that she was no longer facing this nightmare alone. Nathan shifted slightly, pressing his arm against hers in a subtle gesture of reassurance. The warmth of that simple touch sent a shiver down her spine, awakening feelings she'd never dared to explore. She'd never dated, never kissed anyone, never let anyone close enough to risk her heart. But here, now, tied up beside a man she had only known for minutes, she felt her guard slipping, her walls crumbling. She watched Nathan's profile, the hard line of his jaw, the tension coiled in his shoulders, the quiet determination burning in his eyes. And for the first time in her life, Alice wondered if she was about to learn what it meant to trust someone completely, even in the face of terror. Hours crawled by, and the air in the grand ballroom grew heavy with tension. Alice shifted uncomfortably, feeling the roughness of the ropes digging into her wrists, and the ache in her back from sitting on the cold marble floor. Nathan sat close beside her, his powerful presence a silent shield that kept her from spiraling into panic. The masked leader, a tall man with sharp eyes, paced in front of them, barking orders into a burner phone. Alice could hear snatches of the conversation and understood just enough to realize that this was no simple robbery. The leader mentioned corporate secrets, data transfers, and demands that reached far beyond money. She turned her head slightly, whispering to Nathan, "They are not just here for ransom, are they?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "No," he murmured back, his gray eyes flashing with grim determination. "This is about destroying me and my company. Someone powerful is behind this." Alice's heart sank. She had stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But even as fear coiled tighter around her, she felt a strange spark deep inside, a whisper of defiance she had never known before. Nathan sensed the shift in her. His gaze softened and his voice dropped even lower. "You are stronger than you think, Alice. Stay with me. We will get out of this." She swallowed hard, nodding despite the tears pricking her eyes. She had survived so much already in life. She would survive this too. Suddenly, a loud slap echoed across the room as one of the masked men struck a struggling guest. Alice flinched, instinctively pressing closer to Nathan. Without thinking, Nathan leaned in, his shoulder brushing hers, his breath warm against her ear. "Breathe," he whispered. "Focus on me." Alice closed her eyes, drawing strength from the steady rhythm of his voice. When she opened them again, her gaze locked onto his, and for a heartbeat, the world around them faded away. As the night dragged on, the leader grew impatient. He grabbed Alice by the arm, yanking her upright. "You," he sneered, "are going to prove your loyalty. Take off that dress. Show us you are not hiding anything." Alice's face blanched, her knees wobbling. She tried to stammer out a protest, but the man only tightened his grip. Nathan surged to his feet, his voice sharp as a blade. "Let her go. She is just a waitress." The leader smirked. "Exactly, and if she means nothing, you will not mind if we have a little fun." Alice's heart thundered in her chest. She felt tears spill down her cheeks as the room blurred around her. Before she could be dragged further, Nathan stepped in, his tall frame a wall between her and the attacker. "You hurt her," Nathan said softly, dangerously, "and you will not leave this building alive." For a moment, the masked man hesitated. The billionaire's reputation was legendary, not just for his wealth, but for his connections and influence. Reluctantly, the leader shoved Alice back into Nathan's arms. She collapsed against him, trembling, gasping for breath. Nathan's arms tightened around her, his hand gently stroking her hair. "I have you," he murmured. "I promise you, Alice, I have you." Their closeness sent a rush of heat through Alice's veins, confusing and overwhelming. She was acutely aware of how his chest pressed against her back, how his hands steadied her, how his low voice calmed her frayed nerves. She had never been touched like this, had never let anyone close enough to offer comfort, and yet, wrapped in Nathan's protective embrace, she felt something shift inside her, a fragile yet powerful sense of belonging. As the masked men regrouped, Nathan guided Alice carefully back to the floor, his body a shield beside hers. "We need a plan," he whispered. "Can you help me?" Alice drew a shaky breath, nodding. She had never been brave before, had never been asked to rise above her fears. But something in Nathan's eyes gave her the courage to try. Together they observed the attackers, memorizing patterns, noting weaknesses. Alice's sharp mind worked alongside Nathan's strategic brilliance, the two of them forming an unlikely partnership under fire. Hours later, when a window of opportunity opened, Nathan was ready. He leaned close to Alice, his lips brushing her ear. "When I say run, you run. Do you trust me?" Alice's heart pounded. She had trusted no one her entire life, had survived by keeping her head down and her walls up. But now, Staring into Nathan's fierce, determined eyes, she found herself whispering, "Yes." He gave her the faintest smile, a flash of warmth in the darkness, and then he moved. Chaos erupted as Nathan launched himself at the nearest attacker, knocking the man off balance. Alice bolted toward the side door as Nathan had instructed, her bare feet flying across the marble floor. But just as she reached the exit, a rough hand seized her arm, yanking her backward. She let out a strangled cry as the masked leader slammed her against the wall, snarling, "You are not going anywhere!" Nathan's shout split the air, raw and furious. Alice barely had time to register his figure charging across the room before the world exploded into noise, light, and searing pain. Alice's head throbbed as she struggled to stay conscious, the sharp impact of being slammed against the wall leaving her dazed. She felt the masked leader's grip tighten on her arm, fingers bruising her delicate skin as he dragged her back toward the center of the room. The noise around her blurred into a dull roar, shouts and threats mixing with the terrified cries of the guests. Her heart hammered wildly, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Through the haze, she saw Nathan, fighting like a man possessed, every move precise and lethal as he took down another attacker. The masked leader barked something into his radio, his face twisted in rage. He pulled Alice roughly, pressing a gun to her temple, using her as a human shield. Nathan froze, his chest heaving, his gray eyes dark with fury as they locked onto Alice's tear-streaked face. Alice felt her knees buckle. She had been so close, just steps from freedom. And now she was back in the jaws of danger. She squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. But then she heard Nathan's voice, calm and steady, cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. "Let her go," he said softly, dangerously. "You want me, not her." The leader sneered, digging the gun harder against Alice's head. Nathan took a slow step forward, his hands raised slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You have no idea who you are dealing with," Nathan continued, his voice silk over steel. "You kill her, you destroy your only leverage." The leader hesitated, just long enough for Alice to glimpse doubt flicker in his eyes. Nathan seized the moment, speaking low and fast. "You have already lost. The police are surrounding the building. You have minutes left, maybe seconds. Use your brain. Walk out now and survive, or push that trigger and guarantee you will not." Alice felt the leader's grip loosen, his hand trembling slightly. She dared to peek at Nathan, seeing the tight line of his jaw, the fierce determination blazing in his eyes. Then, without warning, the leader shoved Alice to the ground and bolted. She hit the floor hard, gasping, her vision swimming. Nathan was there in an instant, scooping her up in his strong arms, his voice a rough whisper in her ear. "Hafai for ner kayuti. Lastir ayer ayu, you are safe." She clung to him, sobbing softly, burying her face against his chest as the room erupted into noise again. Police stormed in, shouting commands, dragging the attackers down one by one. Nathan held Alice tightly, shielding her from the chaos, his heartbeat thudding steady and strong against her cheek. The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics checked Alice over, wrapping her in a blanket and shining lights in her eyes. Reporters swarmed outside the hotel, their cameras flashing wildly as news of the hostage rescue spread like wildfire. Nathan stood a few steps away, speaking quietly to the police, his face pale but composed. Every few moments, his gaze flicked back to Alice, checking on her. She sat numbly, clutching the blanket tighter, her mind spinning. She had survived. Somehow, against all odds, she was alive. But even more bewildering was the realization that she was alive because of Nathan Blackwood. As dawn broke over the city, Nathan crossed the room and crouched beside her. His hand brushed gently against her arm, his touch achingly tender. "How are you holding up?" he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. Alice blinked back tears, trying to find her voice. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why did you save me?" "I'm nobody." Nathan's mouth curved in a faint, tired smile. "You're not nobody, Alice. You were brave. You mattered. You mattered to me." Her breath caught, a tremor running through her chest. She had spent her entire life fading into the background, unnoticed and unimportant. And now, here was this powerful, untouchable man, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Before she could speak, Nathan squeezed her hand softly. "Get some rest," he said. "You've been through hell." He hesitated, then added, "If you ever need anything, find me." And then he was gone, swept away by police, reporters, and business associates. Alice watched him disappear, her heart aching in ways she could not explain. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, shivering despite the warmth, feeling the ghost of his touch lingering on her skin. She told herself it was over, that she would go back to her small life, her struggling existence. But deep down, something told her the story was far from finished. Days passed. Alice tried to return to normal, working her shifts at the small bakery where she had picked up extra hours. She avoided the news, avoided the photos of Nathan that flooded every headline, avoided the ache in her chest every time she remembered his eyes on hers. She told herself it had been a moment, a fluke, a brush with a world she would never belong to. She tried to bury the memories, to focus on caring for her mother, on paying the mounting bills, on keeping her head down. But every night, as she lay in bed, she replayed Nathan's words over and over. "You mattered. You mattered to me." And no matter how hard she tried, she could not forget. The bakery was quiet that afternoon, the warm scent of freshly baked bread filling the air as Alice wiped down the counters. She kept her head down, focusing on the simple, repetitive task, willing herself not to think about the past few days. Her body still ached faintly from the bruises left by rough hands, but it was the ache inside her chest that weighed the heaviest. She told herself over and over that Nathan Blackwood had moved on, that he was a man from a different world, a billionaire, with no reason to remember a scared little waitress. She told herself that what they had shared in those terrible hours was nothing but adrenaline and fear, but her heart whispered a different story. The soft chime of the bell over the door jolted her out of her thoughts. She glanced up, her breath catching in her throat. Nathan stood just inside, his tall figure framed by the afternoon light. He wore no suit today, no polished armor of wealth and power, just dark jeans and a simple sweater, his hair slightly tousled as if he had run his hands through it on the drive over. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nathan took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been looking for you, Sectionaber." "Palain damaki troyer," you said softly. Alice's hands trembled on the cloth she was holding. "Why?" she whispered. "You're safe now, you don't need me." Nathan's jaw tightened, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "That's where you're wrong." He stepped closer, his voice low and rough. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, Alice, about what you did, about how brave you were, about how you made me feel." Alice felt her heart pound so hard she thought it might break. She shook her head slightly, struggling to hold back tears. "Nathan, we come from two different worlds. You don't owe me anything." Nathan closed the distance between them, his hands reaching out to gently take hers. His touch was warm and steady, grounding her as she wavered. "This isn't about owing you," he said quietly. "This is about wanting you. I can't explain it. I've spent my life surrounded by people who want my money, my influence, my power. But you saw me. You weren't afraid of me. You stood by me when you had every reason to run." Alice's breath hitched as she stared up into his eyes, the world narrowing until there was nothing but the two of them. "I was terrified," she confessed in a shaky whisper. "I've never been so scared in my life." Nathan's mouth curved in a small, tender smile. "And yet you stayed. That's what makes you remarkable." He leaned in slightly, his forehead brushing hers. "Please, Alice, don't walk away from this." For a long moment, they stood there in the quiet bakery, hearts pounding in unison, the weight of unspoken feelings pressing between them. Suddenly the bell over the door chimed again, and a sharp voice cut through the moment. "How touching!" Alice and Nathan turned sharply as a tall figure stepped inside, flanked by two men in dark suits. Alice's stomach dropped as she recognized the masked leader, now unmasked, his eyes cold and furious. Nathan moved instantly, pushing Alice behind him, his body tensing protectively. "I knew you'd come looking for her," the man sneered. "You made it easy." Nathan's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" The leader's smile was razor sharp. "What I wanted from the start. Leverage. You cost me everything, Blackwood. Now I'm taking it back." Without warning, the two men lunged. Nathan shoved Alice aside, catching the first attacker with a hard punch. Alice stumbled back, heart racing, as the fight erupted in the middle of the bakery. Nathan moved with lethal precision, every strike controlled, every move calculated. But there were two of them, and Nathan was only one man. Alice watched in horror as he took a hard blow to the ribs, staggering slightly. The leader grabbed Alice, yanking her backward, his arm locking tightly around her waist. She let out a strangled cry as the cold press of a gun touched her side. Nathan's head snapped up, his face paling as he saw Alice struggling. "Let her go," he snarled, his voice raw with fury. The leader smirked, tightening his grip. "You want her? Come get her." Nathan moved forward, but the man pressed the gun harder against Alice, making her whimper. For a heartbeat, everything hung in the balance, and then Alice, shaking with fear but driven by pure instinct, did the only thing she could think of. She slammed her heel down hard on the man's foot, twisting sharply as his grip faltered. Nathan lunged, closing the distance in a flash, his fist connecting with the leader's jaw with bone-crunching force. Alice stumbled free, gasping, as Nathan tackled the man to the ground. Police sirens wailed outside, the bakery filling with flashing blue and red lights. Nathan's security team burst through the door, subduing the attackers in seconds. Alice collapsed onto her knees, trembling, as Nathan rushed to her side, gathering her into his arms. "Are you okay?" he whispered urgently, his hands cupping her face, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Alice choked out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I think so," she whispered. Nathan let out a rough breath, pulling her tightly against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you, Alice." She clung to him, her heart pounding wildly as the sirens wailed and the world spun around them. In that moment she realized that whatever came next, whatever dangers or challenges they faced, they would face them together. The days following the second attack unfolded in a way Alice could never have imagined. She was no longer just a waitress hiding in the corners of life. She was now front-page news, the brave young woman who had survived 2 hostage situations and somehow captured the attention of one of the most powerful men in the country. But none of the headlines told the real story, the quiet moments, the tangled emotions, the slow unraveling of walls she had spent her entire life building. Alice sat on the plush sofa of Nathan's penthouse, staring out at the glittering skyline. She wore a soft robe Nathan had draped over her shoulders, and her wet hair clung to her skin from the shower she had just taken. The scent of lavender still clung faintly to her. Her legs were curled under her, a cup of tea resting between her hands, but she barely noticed the warmth. Her mind was too full. Nathan sat across from her, his gray eyes sharp yet shadowed. He had just finished a long call with his security team, discussing the latest updates on the men who had attacked them. His body was tense, every muscle coiled tight, but his gaze softened when it rested on Alice. "You should rest," he murmured gently, crossing the room to kneel beside her. Alice looked down at him, her heart squeezing painfully in her chest. "I can't," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it again. The guns, the threats, the fear. I can't stop hearing the sounds." Her voice cracked, tears slipping down her cheeks. Nathan reached up, his thumb brushing away the tears with a tenderness that shattered her. "I know," he murmured. "I know, sweetheart." He gathered her into his arms, pulling her gently onto his lap. She buried her face against his neck, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady rise and fall of his breath. "You're safe now," Nathan whispered into her hair. "I won't let anything happen to you ever again." They sat like that for a long time, the city humming quietly around them, the world narrowed to the small space they occupied. Nathan's hand stroked her back slowly, grounding her, calming the tremors in her body. Alice felt herself relax by degrees, her heartbeat slowing, her breathing evening out. Finally, she pulled back slightly, looking up into Nathan's face. "Why me?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his. "You could have anyone, Nathan. Why are you here with me?" Nathan's lips curved in a faint, bittersweet smile. "Because you're real," he said quietly. "Because when everything was falling apart, you were the only thing that mattered. You didn't want my money or my power. You just wanted to survive. And somehow, in saving you, I saved myself." Alice's chest tightened, her emotions surging so powerfully she could hardly breathe. She had never been loved, never been wanted like this, and yet here was Nathan, this impossible man, offering her everything she had never dared to hope for. As the night deepened, Nathan carried her to the guest room, though they both knew she would end up in his arms before dawn. He laid her gently on the bed, pulling the covers around her, his hand lingering at her cheek. "Rest," he whispered. "We'll face everything else tomorrow." But sleep did not come easily. Alice lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about her mother, still recovering in the hospital, about her old apartment, about the life she had left behind. And then she thought about Nathan, the weight of his gaze, the heat of his touch, the fierce protectiveness in his every word. Hours later, unable to bear the restless silence, she slipped quietly from the bed and padded barefoot through the dark penthouse. She found Nathan in his office, slumped over his desk, papers scattered around him. His head rested on his arms, his shoulders tense even in sleep. Alice stood in the doorway, her heart aching as she watched him. She moved softly across the room, her robe trailing behind her, and laid a hand gently on his back. Nathan stirred, his eyes blinking open, softening immediately when he saw her. "Hey," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Couldn't sleep?" Alice shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Neither could you." Nathan reached for her hand, pulling her gently into his lap. She curled against him, resting her head on his shoulder, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They sat together in the dim light, neither speaking for a long time. Finally, Alice broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm scared, Nathan," she whispered. "What if this never ends? What if we're always looking over our shoulders?" Nathan kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "Then we face it together," he said, quietly. "I'm not going anywhere. Alice." "Not now. Not ever." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not just from fear. They were from something deeper, something fiercer, something that felt dangerously like love. Later that morning, Nathan made his decision. He called in his team, gathered his closest advisors, and laid out a plan. He was going to end this, once and for all. He would not let anyone else be hurt, and he would not let Alice live in fear another day. Alice watched him from the doorway, her heart pounding as she saw the full force of his determination. She had known Nathan as a protector, a comforter, a man who held her gently in the dark, but now she saw him as something more, a fighter, a leader, a man willing to risk everything for the people he loved. As the plan unfolded, Alice found herself swept up in the storm. She stood beside Nathan as he confronted old enemies, brokered dangerous deals, and dismantled the network that had targeted them. She watched as he faced down threats, with steel in his spine and fire in his eyes. And through it all, he never let go of her hand. By the time the dust settled, they were both exhausted, battered, but unbroken. Alice leaned against Nathan on the balcony, staring out at the city as dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds. Nathan pressed a kiss to her temple, his arms wrapped securely around her. "It's over," he murmured. Alice let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she whispered. "I was just a waitress, Nathan, and now—" Nathan turned her gently, cupping her face in his hands. "Now you're the woman I can't live without," he said softly. "You're the woman who saved me, Alice." She let out a soft, choked laugh, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed. Nathan smiled, brushing a thumb tenderly across her skin. "Then we'll figure it out together," he promised, one step at a time. As the sun rose over the city, Alice rested her head against Nathan's chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Alice stood before the wide windows of Nathan's penthouse, gazing out at the city skyline glowing under the evening sky. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass, a reminder of the girl she used to be, the shy, invisible waitress who had once been too afraid to dream of anything beyond survival. And yet, here she was, wrapped in a soft robe Nathan had left for her, her hair still damp from a long bath, her skin tingling from the memory of his touch. She heard quiet footsteps behind her and turned just as Nathan approached, his tall figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the room. He carried 2 glasses of wine, his eyes soft as they met hers. Without a word, he handed her a glass, his fingers lingering against hers for just a moment too long. They moved to the sofa together, settling close as the city lights blinked to life below. Alice curled her legs under her, cradling her wineglass, feeling a nervous flutter in her chest. Nathan studied her in the soft light, his eyes searching, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Alice blinked in surprise. "Regret what?" Nathan let out a soft breath, his thumb tracing the rim of his glass. "Letting me in," he murmured. "Letting all of this in." Alice set her glass down carefully, her fingers trembling just slightly. She turned toward Nathan, her heart full, her voice soft but certain. "I was scared," she admitted. "I'm still scared, Nathan, but no, I don't regret it. Not for 1 second." Nathan's eyes darkened with emotion, his jaw tightening as he reached out to take her hand in his. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he whispered, his voice raw. "Someone who sees me, not the company, not the money, not the power, just me." Alice leaned in, her forehead resting gently against his, their breaths mingling in the quiet space between them. "And I never thought anyone would choose me," she whispered back, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Nathan brushed a thumb tenderly across her cheek, his touch achingly gentle. "I choose you, Alice," he murmured, "every day for the rest of my life." They kissed then, slow and deep, a promise sealed in the softness of their lips and the heat of their embrace. Alice felt herself melt into him, her walls falling away, her heart opening wide for the first time in her life. She knew there would be challenges ahead, that the world outside this moment was still complicated and uncertain. But she also knew that they would face it all together, hand in hand, heart to heart. As the night deepened and the stars glittered overhead, Alice rested her head against Nathan's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She felt his arms wrap securely around her, his breath warm against her hair, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet. "You saved me, Alice," he whispered. "You remind me what matters." Alice closed her eyes, a small, contented smile curving her lips. She thought of the girl she had been, the girl who had stumbled into the wine cellar for one wild night, who had woken up naked and vulnerable, but had found something far more valuable than she ever expected, a love that was real, fierce, and worth fighting for. And as she drifted toward sleep, wrapped in Nathan's arms, she knew that she was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer alone. She was home,